Welcome everyone to War, Revolutions and Terror Week 10. I just want to refresh your memory about the role of the intellectuals, the intelligentsia, and some of the ideas that had been in circulation. We had talked about Marx and how Marx enters Russia last week, and I also did touch upon, I realized actually that I had neglected to show you this slide, so I just wanted to put this slide up. But to recap, before we look at how the social intellectuals who had gained control of the Soviets would play a decisive role in ultimately the program or the shape of the program, but that also meant the contestations that were going on for steering what was, we call it the Russian Revolution, but another term we could use, and which would be absolutely accurate, is the complete social breakdown of the institutions of the Russian Empire, a complete social breakdown. So the revolution is in a sense only possible because of that breakdown, but the revolution is also helping drive that breakdown. Now, from about the 1870s on, we start to see an increasing acceptance within the socialist movement of Marxism in one shape or other, but that is providing the decisive intellectual template for trying to understand reality and how they were going to change it. As you will also remember me pointing out, that liberal ideas that were so decisive in shaping Western institutions, by and large, they had almost no widespread acceptance amongst the intelligentsia. So as you recall, Kerensky, who had been head of the provisional government, who ultimately had to flee because he just couldn't garner any support around him, he was a socialist. He was not in any way, shape or form a liberal democrat, even though at different stages in the, or earlier within the provisional government, those that were closer to wanting to work with industry, wanting to work with investors, did play a role in that government, but there were all sorts of other forces and factions at work. Initially, it's this link between the intelligentsia and the peasantry based upon a somewhat idealized vision or view of what it was that peasant conditions were like and what it offered in terms of a Russian future, that really took hold of the intelligentsia and in its relationship to a revolutionary ideal, which we could say is very populist. So two figures that are very important that I mentioned were Alexander Herzen and Nikolai Chernyshevsky. Both of them very widely read, very influential, and both of them were really exposing, and you can see the name of their two most famous novels. They were really exposing, and they were novels. And that's another point. We'll see that the literati also played an important role in providing a vision of what kind of future the intelligentsia were committed to. But the very question, who is to blame, what is to be done? And you will recall that Lenin also used that title, what is to be done, when he made the argument that there was needed to be a revolutionary party, a vanguard, as he called it, of the proletariat, who would basically lead the proletariat and prevent it from simply reaching what he called trade union consciousness, which was basically, in Lenin's view, just a means of capital co-opting industrial labor, and in that co-option, the revolutionary proletariat would never be able to achieve what he hoped and believed could be achieved through a socialist stroke communist Russia. Now, Herzen, he had also mixed with some of the neo-Hegelians, left Hegelians, that's that circle that was around Karl Marx, and also mixed with French socialists, including Blanqui, who I mentioned last week, who had a very similar kind of strategy to Lenin in the role he attributes to a small elite of revolutionaries. He was also editor of the Bell, but his big point was he saw the peasant communes as the future idea. But that meant freeing them of landlords and state taxation. Only the optioner could save the Russian people, the option of being these peasant collectives. Now, the peasantry, again, I pointed this out earlier, they weren't interested in replacing one landlord for another. And insofar as the state were extracting resources from them, they were tending to be supportive of anyone that basically promised them that they would be left alone, which is exactly what the intelligentsia, who were connecting up with the peasantry in terms of providing a populist anti-czarist program, were promising. Nikolai Chernyshevsky, he also called for student communes to connect with the people. So, as I said, some of the students had come out of the peasantry, or declasse peasants, as many were moving into the cities. But in the main, what we see is that you have even if you come from somewhere, once your life experiences revolve around making abstractions, reading books, talking, organizing in revolutionary ideas and organizing themselves, your life, it's a very, very different thing to what the peasant life is. And at the end of the day, what we're going to see is whoever gets control of the revolution is still going to need a food supply. So they're going to make sure that the peasantry supplies food, which often means under duress. And in fact, that's exactly how it played itself out. So here are two novelists. Another novelist, very well read and very important in Russia in the 19th century, was a guy called Turgenev, and his book Father and Sons was really a depiction of a generation that had lost all faith in what its fathers had believed in. So he identified, and he calls this group nihilists. And nihilist, in his understanding of the term, basically means a complete break with, a complete turning on the back of everything that mattered before. Nothing, nihilism, matters. Another writer, though this one is very interesting in a different way, Dostoevsky had, as a young man, been attracted to these revolutionary populist ideals. He had even been sentenced to death and under the Tsarist regime. And just when he was going to be shot, he was given a reprieve. And his time spent in Siberia, seeing other prisoners and talking to them, gave him a wealth of experience into what the revolutionaries were like. But after that retrieve, he completely changed his mind, and basically he had faith in the Russian church and the Russian people. So he was very pro-Slavic, very pro-Russian people, but very critical of these revolutionary ideas, which he ultimately saw as diabolical. And he does this in a fantastic work called The Devils, or sometimes translated as The Dispossessed. I can't urge you strongly enough to read that book. It's a fantastic book. But the other great work of his, and he's got a number of great works. The Idiot, Crime and Punishment are fantastic works. Notes from the Underground. But his masterpiece is a book called The Brothers Karamazov. And in The Brothers Karamazov, he also sets up this picture of what he calls the God-man, and he wants to provide a critique, and that's basically what he sees, is that this younger generation, the generation called nihilist by Turgenev, he sees them as deeply damaged, and much of The Brothers Karamazov is about the damage of that generation and about how disfigured spiritually they are, and how out of this disfigurement comes this diabolical plot to try and, in a sense, challenge God and to create a fantastical world which Dostoevsky thinks, given the Russian character, but given the human character, and given social circumstances, opportunity, and the nature of society, all of this figures in his mindset, this will lead to nothing other than a horror show. And he ends up being proven right. Now, Dostoevsky was very popular in Russia, but in the main, he was only used by the intelligentsia to the extent that, mainly, to the extent that he still provided a critique of certain features of Russian society, but ultimately he was like a voice crying in the wilderness. There were others, there were lots of journals and lots of pamphlets and lots of reading materials, basically, that were pushing for this new world. You take this in conjunction with the fact that I pointed out last week, that the people being trained at the universities to create a new professional class, to develop the new skills, to basically engineer a future in which Russia would go from essentially a feudal society, medieval society in some respects, into modern times. We see that they were really taking their ideas from writers, activists, but none of these people really had any political experience in terms of actually building something, of actually being involved in the to and fro of trying to gauge what different groups want, testing a policy that is basically has sufficient electoral support, because there's simply no democratic space in which this can take place. So the literati, the intelligentsia, it's all smokes and mirrors, so to speak. It's all dreamlike. I did mention Bakunin and Chayev last week, so I won't carry on with them. But that point I wanted to make is, from the peasant side, on the one hand, they shrug their shoulders and thought, oh well, you know, these are kids, and we don't really like what's happening around us, and we certainly don't like our paying too much tax or being under the servitude of landowners. But ultimately, they want something very different, and we'll see that when the revolution comes, this is going to be a big issue. So we'll also bear in mind that there's a group of intellectuals that remain more committed to them, and a group and a political wing of the socialist movement, because by now, as I said, almost everyone is a socialist who's an intellectual of any sort in Russia. So there will be those that still are captured, if you like, or inspired by this idea of working with the peasantry, certain Slavophile ideals, the Russian soul, the Russian character. But even, as I said, with Herzen and Chernetsky, we've seen people that are very influenced by Western ideas. Okay, now we're going back now to the thinking about the conditions right on the cusp of and during that lead up to, but also play out within the revolution. And you will recall me saying that on the one hand there was the Soviets, which were basically like a local council or local councils, and they had really taken off after 1905 in Russia, plus a provisional government, and neither could completely claim any kind of authority, unmitigated or undisputed authority. And in fact, that was part of the problem, is that you had two sources of elite representation, of elite empowerment and decision-making bodies claiming to speak on behalf of everyone, and they were in tension with each other. Now, within the Soviets themselves, so whereas the Soviets were, in some sense, bodies of representation for the industrial working class in Russia, which you recall is a very small percentage of the population, 3%, but obviously in urban centres, they're visibly sizable. They're large numbers there. But if you look at the entirety of the Russian Empire, then it's a very small number. But it wasn't, and this was always the case, and it's been the entire story of Marxism wherever it's played out. It was never the working class themselves that were primarily leading the Soviets. They were very much a responsive. They might have been representative of their factories and their areas in some sense, but to try and broker between them in terms of working out a set of national policies, the Soviets just weren't adequately set up to do that. That wasn't sufficiently part of their brief, and because they weren't, to put it bluntly, they were not the government. But the elite, who were the intelligentsia, were attempting to govern through them, which is another way of saying that is the elite were using the Soviets to try and made themselves indispensable, not to try and, they made themselves indispensable by trying to put together policies and plans that should ultimately be implemented when it was sorted out of who would govern. So the other thing about the members of IFSPOLCOM were not elected by the Soviets. They represented the Socialist Party. So you see this disjuncture straight away. So when, on the one hand, the Bolsheviks, and this would be caught up in when Trotsky also gets disassociated from the party in the conflict with Stalin, and he's basically outsmarted by Stalin and isolated. When Trotsky keeps appealing back to the Soviets, and early in the revolution, all power to the Soviets was a very Bolshevik phrase. In point of fact, the Soviets didn't really have the power. The power laid with the socialist parties, and the socialist parties represented in IFSPOLCOM within the Soviets. And a deal was basically drawn up. So every socialist party, this is originally, had a right to 3 seats, 2 from the Central Committee, 1 from a local organisation. So the socialist intellectuals were really creating the Soviet model, and initially Petrograd, and Petrograd, of course, from what I've said earlier, and as you will have picked up, Petrograd was really the epicenter of the revolution. It's not the entirety of Russia, it's Petrograd. But that then gets followed very quickly by Moscow, and this is where the Bolshevik support tends to be. It tends to be in these urban centers. I'll talk about that support, the degree of it in a moment. So initially, the Bolsheviks refused to join. This is in March 17, that should be, 1917. Created a bureau with the majority of Mensheviks to take control of the ill-disciplined Soviets. So the Mensheviks were in control. The Mensheviks, not the Bolsheviks. We will call that break. And the point that, but this source of dispute about which socialist party, this becomes central to the revolution. Again, imagine it, and I can't stress enough how I would encourage you to watch the fantastic documentary put out by Star Media. It's a Russian outlet. There's eight episodes of it. Each one's about 50 minutes. It's got complete footage. By the way, there are some fantastic color-plated documentaries. There's one on Lenin and one on Stalin, where you really get the visuals of the whole thing in great, brought up to date. Now, the Star Media documentary I'm talking about, it's not color-plated, but you really get a great sense of the chaos in the city at the time of the October Revolution, or leading up to the October Revolution and leading up even to the February Revolution. You get these great visuals of that, and you basically get a feeling of a crowd looking to an enthusiastic crowd, but an enthusiastic crowd is not caught up in the day-to-day activities of economic reproduction, and hence of world making that's going to be secure and have a definite future. An enthusiastic crowd can ultimately cheer and yell and boo and ultimately lend support to people with arms, and as we recall, the army being in disarray. So whoever you could get with guns to support you, which returned home soldiers you could get, or reserve soldiers who would point their guns in the direction you wanted them to, that was going to be decisive. And to put it very bluntly, the Bolsheviks were best at doing that. Now, that point I made earlier about the Soviets not representative of the entire country is nicely made by Richard Pipes. The All-Russian Soviets, he said, spoke for only a fraction of the country's inhabitants, 10 to 15% at best, if allowance is made for the peasantry and the bourgeoisie, neither of which was represented. Now there are the class A peasants and those that are sympathetic to the peasantry within the Soviets, but strictly they haven't gone back and done a, we will support all over the country. And remember, the country's in war. That's not even a possibility in a Russian war. If we look across the spectrum of leadership, again, we see a class-based base at the bottom of this. So gentry, those that were born into the gentry or the children of gentry were approximately 20% of the members of socialist parties. And the middle class, and not the peasantry and manual labourers, were left out of the game. Now that's going to be really important. One, as I said, because we'll see what will happen to the peasants, but what will also happen to the proletariat. And remember that the Bolsheviks and are making a claim to be a workers' state. Ultimately, they are. Sorry for using the word ultimately twice. They're claiming to be a workers' state, a proletarian, a dictatorship of the proletariat. But in point of fact, there's almost no real representation at the leadership level in the Socialist Party. They need the working class, especially the manual labourers. They need them as a support base in Petrograd, in Moscow, in the bigger city in Russia. But that doesn't mean that they have a leading role to play. And if you will recall what I said about Lenin's What Is to Be Done, he never really wanted them to have a leading role to play. He always believed that it's only through party, the ideas that are developed within the party, and that means, of course, the people that are most well-read, the people that have travelled more, the people that have seen more, the people, bluntly, that have better ideas. They may not, ultimately, we can look back and say, gee, they haven't read that much and they're not that good ideas, but nevertheless, that's who should be running the show, because they have the skill of using words to mobilize workers. And in this respect, Lenin was very good. Trotsky was absolutely brilliant at this. And that's why during the revolution itself, Trotsky would be a very important Bolshevik in garnering support. And in some ways, he was even more important than Lenin or any of the other leaders of that time. But as we will see when we talk about Trotsky in a bit more depth, he had other problems which led to his isolation. So in 1918, in January, the Bolsheviks basically had 115,000. That had grown from 23,600 in the previous year. Later in the year, those numbers would start to really increase. But you also must remember that Lenin came back with a war chest and money was flowing into the Bolshevik Party. So a number of those people were joining the party to get their hands on some rubles. Now, that's not unimportant. And I mentioned to you last week, and I'll give you in a later slide a reference that I strongly recommend, is how the whole operation was being financed. If we look at a breakdown of the Bolsheviks, we see that 32% were white-collar employees or petty intelligentsia. They did have something like 38% of D Class A peasants, but we recall that the industrial working class was essentially made of D Class A peasants. That is, people whose parents and grandparents had been peasants and now drifting into the city to get any kind of work they did. Ultimately, the Mensheviks would be driven more even by skilled workers. If anything, they had more professionals and intellectuals than even the Bolsheviks. We also see that there's a kind of regional support for the Bolsheviks. And this is going to be very important to bear in mind when you think about the Civil War, because a civil war breaks out almost immediately after the Bolsheviks take power. So they don't come to power in a civil war. And indeed, in the early stage of the revolution, when it's becoming clear that Russians are turning against Russians, this is just heartbreaking for a lot of military leaders and other members of the provisional government who are horrified by this turning into a civil war, given that they've just been in 4 years of war where they're appealing to national unity. Now, of course, the Bolsheviks had foreseen there would have to be a civil war. The framework, though, of their civil war was not just in Russia. They saw the civil war as being worldwide, as a global civil war, taking fire in Europe. Then Lenin starts to adjust it and think, well, we will have it first in Russia, but that will be like a fuse leading to the explosion in Western Europe. And as I said to you before, that never happened. There was not enough. There were a few sporadic revolutionary attempts in Bavaria, for example, and some places in Germany. But in the main, what had taken place was that the workers' parties in Western Europe, especially in France and Great Britain, that they had found a way to get parliamentary representation, and they were using that to build up a more welfare kind of state in which certain industries would be nationalized. So they didn't need such radical solutions. They were able to negotiate and try and figure out what was beneficial in a market society and what was not. And this is a very different kind of experience. Okay. I mentioned Lenin had been sent back with a war chest. That had been arranged by a very wealthy Bolshevik supporter, a guy called Purvis, in Germany. And it was a very smart move by the Germans. And I think I mentioned last week, Lenin had his own thing. He said, the Germans think they're playing me, but I'm playing them. Because ultimately, when I go back and campaign against the war, I'm also as interested in campaigning with the German soldiers to overthrow their masters as with the Russian soldiers to overthrow their masters. So, and if you think about the fact that eventually Germany and Russia would be pitted, or the Soviet Union would be pitted into this massive war against each other, you could see that Germany really created a monster in order to solve a particular problem. And not an uncommon phenomenon in politics. People don't realize that they're setting up something that in the future is going to be far more destructive than what they're actually facing. So Lenin had gone back with the pile of other socialists, or pile of 50, 60, I can't remember, on a train, going back into Germany. They had a big war chest. McMeekin said it was about 50 million gold marks. Then other money would be coming in different ways to the Bolsheviks, and that's why I mentioned Spence. You can look at that, but there's also, it's not only some people in Wall Street supporting the Bolsheviks, but there's also internal, very wealthy people, and that raises a very interesting question. And it once again confirms a problem within Marxism, because Marx had basically predicted that this would all be coming from the working class, but the resources were coming from the very class to be extinguished. And the very simple question is, why would they do that? Why is it that very wealthy people will ultimately contribute to a cause that would bring about their own lack of wealth, their own destruction, if this cause became actual? One answer to that is, once people have so much, their lives are good, and they don't really envisage that they will ever lose that. And they think that if they're helping this other group, that they will be appreciated, and so that they will be all right. But they have an imagination about what the world could be, and they think that they can help realize it. And to them, at least, it looks like this could be a very good world. This would be a world, and this was the whole point of why, in the West, as we will see later, so many members of the intelligentsia either were openly supporting the Soviet Union or were what was called fellow travelers. And the fellow travelers was those that basically weren't active in any communist parties in the Western world, but very sympathetic. And that included a lot of intelligentsia members, people in the entertainment industry, journalists, and so on. So, as we also said, with the Soviet councils and the army, the Bolsheviks were able to gain increasingly support amongst the troops, and that led to more mutiny and mass defection in Galicia especially, which at one stage thought maybe they could have won. Now, one of the reasons Kerensky loses power, I think, in part it's because of the conflict between the provisional government and the Soviets. But in part it's because when history is being made and no one is fully conscious of what anyone else is doing, and no one is fully conscious of all the possible forces at work, and you've got to ride your luck and have an iron will. And that's what Lenin did. And Kerensky's problem was he didn't have an iron will and he didn't have any luck. Those two things, Napoleon once says, what's most necessary in winning a war? He said, lucky general. And I think that's, in a sense, the same is true with a slight modification of that formulation, is true in revolution. What makes you, well, fortune and people around you that also happen to do the right things. And Kerensky was, although he had called outrightly for violence, and you hopefully remember that from an early lecture, against the Tsar, and then that was scrubbed from the records of the Duma when he said this, but nevertheless he had done that. When it came to action, and when it came to the fact that he was in a collision course with the Bolsheviks, initially he had rounded them up. A number had been imprisoned. Lenin again went into exile, went up to Finland, but he didn't follow through. And in part that's because Kerensky himself was always having to deal with the socialists, and he was really part of the socialist, the SR group, the Socialist Revolutionary, those closest to that populist peasantry base. And he had sacked his justice minister, Pavel, how do you say that? Perivera says, sorry for my terrible pronunciation, who was calling for the shooting of deserters. So he was, calling for the shooting of deserters, but it was just chaos. And he did, to put it bluntly, he didn't strike severely enough, strongly enough, viciously enough against the Bolsheviks. He would vacillate, and then when things were really obviously completely out of control, when it was obvious that the only ones that could take control of the nation were the most brutal, bloody and well-armed group, again, he vacillated. So he had been involved, there had been talk with this guy called Boris Savinkov and General Kornilov, he will come up again, in coming up with a kind of collective dictatorship. But the Soviets, very hostile to Kornilov, and that meant that if he had wanted to do this, if Kerensky had wanted to do this, he would have to cut himself from the Soviet support. And you remember that Kerensky had one foot in the Soviets camp and one foot in the provisional government, though it was as a provisional government head that he was mainly now playing his role. But Kornilov wanted to disarm the Soviets. He wanted to introduce martial law. He wanted to restore order, as a military man naturally would. And this led to tension. Kerensky couldn't back him 100%. There wasn't the support. It's interesting, this character Savinkov, who's also involved in these discussions, was a former assassin of imperial officials, right? And then he was a socialist revolution. He would then become a Bolshevik, anti-Bolshevik, sorry, become a white, and after return to Russia, to the Soviet Union, he would be executed. So you can see the kind of choices leading to radical shifts. And this is of course what happens in crisis. We saw that with the French Revolution, how one moment, one group seemed to be on top of everything. And then the next minute they're being subjected to the firing squad, or in the case of the terror, the guillotine mostly. So people are constantly being forced to adapt new positions because the circumstances are being changed, and their alignment with the support base that they have, that's all in flux as well. And the ideas that are driving. Now, coming back to Kornilov, he had previously been appointed by Gukov. You remember Alexander Gukov? In the last lecture, I talked a little bit about him. As commander, he had been plotting all the time to try and get rid of the Tsar. As commander of Petrograd military to break up mutiny before he resigned his post and took up command in Galicia. He mistakenly believed, and this was really a problem, that there was this guy, and this is where the misfortune comes in. A former Octoberist deputy called Lyov had given Kornilov the impression that Kerensky was supporting him to take control of the army, introduce military law, and become a dictator. And Kornilov was convinced that Kerensky had supported this, whereas Kerensky was thinking Kornilov is now wanting to completely destroy all the gains of the revolution. He's wanting to set up a military dictatorship, and we're back with autocracy. We've gone nowhere. So this is, and Kerensky then publicly turns against Kornilov. Now, note this: the only way that Kerensky, I think, could have held power was to have cooperated with Kornilov. Now, there still would have been a civil war, no doubt about that. But had he acted early enough, he might have been in the winning team. At this stage, it's hard to say. But that's the other thing. You see, Lenin had an iron stomach for blood, so to speak. Lenin's forcefulness of will, which even at times alienated and shocked other important members of the Bolshevik party like Zinoviev and Kamenev, who didn't want to go along with some of the things that Lenin was doing, didn't want to support a coup, who wanted to be much more open to negotiating with the other parties, Socialist Party. It was Lenin's ruthlessness that made the Bolsheviks successful. So, what does success mean? That's going to be the big question. It's successful in gaining power, but what it does with that power, you can only say whether that was a success or not when you read off what comes out of the revolution, which is what we're talking about today, and possibly the first half an hour of next week's lecture. And again, it was here's another piece of good fortune. Because Kerensky is now so isolated, the Mensheviks come seeking amnesty for the Bolshevik leadership, for the Bolsheviks, who Kerensky had tried to round up. And Lenin had escaped wearing women's clothing. And had he been caught, this is again, the smallest things can make an enormous difference in history. A battle might be determined by the footing that soldiers have upon a particular hill, or by the weather, or by the conditions of visibility, or not to mention knowledge about what the other forces are doing and all of that, and just sheer ferocity of engagement, all of these things. But But had Lenin been recognized and executed, I don't think the Bolsheviks would have come to power, because I don't think they would have had a sufficiently hard-willed person to drive the other members, leaders of the party, to then go and see. Trotsky was very good at enthusing people, but it was Lenin. It was Lenin that had that charismatic leadership ability that not only affected the bigger group you were talking to, which Trotsky could do, but could convince others in the inner circle around him that he was right. And even Trotsky, who had been in such bitter, acrimonious conflict with Lenin for years and years, once he put his oar in with the Bolsheviks, then he was, I think in some ways they were all somewhat spellbound by Lenin's magnetic personality. And he did have a magnetic personality. There's a story when Stalin first met him, how disappointed he was actually to see this rather little man. But over time, there's no question that Stalin is thinking of usurping Lenin. He knows where he sits. He knows what Lenin means to the revolution. He knows that Lenin's got that magic touch. Okay, so not failing to act. The Mensheviks, though, many of them will be slaughtered by the Bolsheviks, but they've helped the Bolsheviks, just as Kerensky had helped get rid of the Tsar, has helped the process whereby the whole social breakdown occurs. And we see that the Mensheviks are ultimately going to be victims, just as we saw. This happens all the time. That the momentum of a revolution keeps crushing those that are in the way of the more willful ones trying to give shape and hold on to the revolution. Okay. And Kerensky had also been warned by this General Lukomsky that what they're doing, because of what the Bolsheviks are doing, is ultimately you're making chaos, and this will lead to civil war. So Kerensky had opened the way by doing this also for the continued Bolshevization of the army. Again, we've got to remember, when the revolution is occurring between February and October, or all the chaos that's occurring, and then we say that second revolution is October, but really it's the whole thing is happening all the time. When that is occurring, Russia is still at war, and it's in chaos at war, as I said. So in 1917, there are Soviet elections. So again, they're Soviet elections, they're local council elections. They're basically, you could say, they represent the enclaves of enterprise or production or activity that from which the Soviets are drawn. So, but they are not in any way, shape, or form to be misconstrued as something like a Russian-wide democratic election. It's not that. So the Bolsheviks had won majority because that's where their support base was. And in fact, to repeat myself, if the further you would go out from Petrograd or Moscow and maybe a couple of other cities, the further you would find that Bolshevik support dwindling. But again, one of the reasons the Bolsheviks were also supported, and another place they found support, was in the army, because you had all these people that didn't want to fight. So the network of Soviets started to spread, and there were about 900 of them. And they were defending a revolutionary order, and they seized the Kremlin. So for them, the provisional government were the enemy. Then there was a Congress of Soviets, and the socialist revolutionaries and the Mensheviks, seeing the dictatorial tactics of the Bolsheviks, who you can see already had a slight majority, and the SRs, the socialist revolutionaries, and the Mensheviks could see that what was happening is that there was a usurpation of the process by the Bolsheviks, that it wasn't what they had thought would be the case. It wasn't, we are all one because we are against the provisional government and we have been against the Tsar and we want revolution in Russia and we are all socialists, so we will come to an agreement. It was becoming very clear that the intentions of the Bolsheviks were to dominate and push through their program. Now, on October the 26th, the Bolsheviks declared freeing all political prisoners and arresting commissars. Also, remember that Kerensky had wanted to free all political prisoners. That had been part of his program. This, whenever you have a revolutionary program, it's like Lenin was against, another good example. Robespierre was against the death penalty. And then, once he's on the Committee of Public Safety, once the conditions are such which you can't see the revolution any other way, he's in favour of mass bloodletting. Virtue is terror. Remember that formulation that I talked about in a much earlier lecture. Very similar with Lenin. Lenin's against the death penalty. Lenin's against, free political prisoners. At the opportune moment, but very quickly, we'll start to see the restoration of capital punishment. We will start to see the restoration of shooting people in the army who disobey orders. We'll start to see the return in much greater scale than what preceded it of political prisoners. But the one thing was the right of private ownership of land forever. The right of private ownership of land forever. This would introduce a phase that has come to be retrospectively called war communism. But basically, anyone could get their whole hands on anything. It became a kind of free-for-all. It became a kind of mass plundering operation. Again, certain certificates would have to be authorised in some way, but anyone who was considered to be a bourgeois and had an apartment or a flat, that could be requisitioned by the people. And so all these families would move in there, and that other family moved out, and this was kind of chaos. Now note this, the new government, Lenin was the chairman. Stalin was the commissar for nationalities. Stalin was very smart. Stalin appreciated that the success of the revolution would depend upon how it linked up with other nationalities and how he could bring about what would ultimately be called a Soviet Union, a union of the Soviets. So he had to find a way, and he recognized this, and Lenin appreciated this and also saw this, because one of the things that happened is when the Bolsheviks seized power, there's all sorts of, as we will see, attempts to secede from the Russian Empire, and which ultimately means also to secede from Bolshevik rule once the Bolsheviks take power. So Stalin, he gets a very important portfolio. Trotsky becomes foreign minister, and then he will become minister of the army. In the first instance, foreign minister, because that's to do with negotiating any kind of peace. Now, what I want you to notice here is that every other person, from Trotsky down, that I've given you in this new government, ends up being executed under Stalin in the wave of what we call the Great Terror, which I will be talking about later in this lecture, or very early next week, probably later in this lecture. What happened too is that if Ispolcom was dissolved, because there's no need now for the socialist revolutionaries and the Mensheviks in terms of governing the country. The Bolsheviks are going to do that. They've been replaced with a majority. There's still some allowed there, but ultimately it's all gone. It had no role to play. It was a coup. To put it bluntly, it's a coup. And there's lots of resistance to that. Because here now we have the Bolsheviks claiming to speak on behalf of all the working class and indeed everybody, but everybody is only, the only people that matter are the working class. The peasantry, though, are kind of given a de facto or kind of recognised as having similar interests with the proletariat when in fact they don't, but they're framed as having similar interests, and they certainly have the interest of wanting to usurp land from any landlord. So they're very happy to take land, get up involved in a land grab. But when it comes to specific branches of work where you've got unionized labor that don't want to accept what the Bolshevik program is, or don't want to accept ultimately the dictatorship of the Bolshevik, they're coming into conflict with them. So you get all these strikes which are immediately being put down by the Bolsheviks. So there's civil servants protest. Again, the Bolsheviks would say the civil servants, they're all part of the old order. The All-Russian Union of State Employees. There's a strike of the Railway Union. The Ministries of Agriculture, Education and Food, the Union of Unions, call for a general strike. Now, you might recall from a much earlier slide that we saw very early on that all these professional classes, did have important representatives in trying to create forums which then would be heeded by the Duma. But what we see now is that that's gone, that forum is gone, and these people, they'll immediately be classified as bourgeois. And ultimately the Bolsheviks will classify anyone as bourgeois. And you will recall in the Marxian paradigm, there's two fundamental classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The proletariat's role, historical role, is to expropriate the means of production from the bourgeoisie. And in practice, this means either incarcerating them, sending them off to the Gulag in Siberia, or ultimately the slave work camps, or killing them. That's going to be what there is. And there's a lot of killing takes place early on. We'll come back to that. Private banks also were refusing to release funds to the Bolsheviks. Again, why would any banker want to release funds to the Bolsheviks? It's going to be expropriated anyway. And he took a number of hostages, $1 billion for ruble. The bank employers then went on strikes, but ultimately the banks weren't going to matter. They were just going to be nationalized. And not only, and that in fact meant that the valuables that people held in the bank, that would be nationalized. So anyone who was wealthy, and it was the wealthy people that had substantial sums of money in the bank, that was all going to go straight to the Bolshevik government. You can imagine the reaction to this. You can imagine, just imagine someone comes and say, we're taking your house. Or if you've got a small business, we're taking your business. You know, you're not going to live the way you've lived previously. We're taking it. Of course, there will be a reaction. And then that reaction leads to the setting up of what's called the checker. And that will go through, this is basically a secret police. It will go through a number of changes of name, but it becomes intrinsic to the kind of state that the Soviet Union becomes. Now, you will recall that it's not too unlike what happened in the Russian Revolution, though the French Revolution. So what you have happening is, again, very similar to what you have in the French Revolution. A regime can only be held in check by identifying its enemies and eliminating them. And that requires a kind of internal surveillance mechanism and armed group who are willing to deal with those people under surveillance. And this grew very quickly. By 1921, the membership was 261,000. I'll come back to that. It's called the Red Terror. I'll come back to that. There was a free election of the whole of Russia. It was the only one in Russia's history up until the end of communism. It was the first and the last. It was in November 1917. The Bolsheviks did not win it. The socialist revolutionaries did. Obviously, where they had strong footing, Petrograd, Moscow, and the army. That's where their support base was. But the socialist revolutionaries had greater support the further you got away from Petrograd, Moscow. The SRs, as I've kept saying a number of times now, were a peasant-based party. Socialist, they were socialists, but they were not an urban-based party. And I mentioned the army in town. The assembly itself, so this will begin the imprisonment of certain SR figures, Mensheviks. Again, some of these, Lenin was a little bit sentimental and didn't really want to arrest them, but ultimately you would find that a number of SRs and Menshevik leaders and upper members of the membership were being put in prison. And some of them were going back to the same prisons, some of them even with the same prison guards. This is all in Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, that they were in before the revolution. You know, the irony of ironies. And then the Third Congress of Soviets is set up, and exclusively Bolsheviks. So this is why it was a coup. Trotsky then would try and negotiate with the Germans to bring about the end of the war. For the Russians, remember the Bolsheviks are playing a game of allowing the Germans to think that they've got what they want, but ultimately they want to go and radicalize all those fighting, not just the Russians, and they ultimately want the Germans to turn around from pointing their guns at the Russians, go back and to turn their guns at German capitalists. So private savings were, I had basically said this, that they were appropriated or confiscated. Owners of safe deposits were required to turn up with keys to hand over valuables. There were still at this stage some folders at the front, and some fronts were predominantly anti-Bolshevik, Galician again. And the Bolsheviks negotiate peace with Germany. And in that negotiation, a lot of Russian territory is being given away. Some of it will be captured back after the revolution. Some of it would gain its independence. And places like Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, the Ukraine would not be able to leave. Belarus would remain part of Russia, the Soviet Empire. But these other ones would become like satellite states. Poland would become a satellite state. Some of this and some of it would be lost and regained later. Again, I'll give the example of Poland, and basically Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine after the Second World War, they come back into it. I hope my memory is right on that. I haven't thought about that for a long time. Okay. Germany's loss in the West means it cannot capitalise on gains of the treaty. So it's a Pyrrhic victory for the Germans. They think they've won, but really and they thought this would really shore them up. But, you know, the Americans by now have come into the war. That's fueled new manpower. And so what's happening on the east and the Western Front is ultimately means that it caves in. Okay. So civil war breaks out almost as soon as the Bolsheviks seize power. Now, because of the disarray of what had been happening in the war, there had been various Muslim revolts in Central Asia against the Russian Empire. going way back to 1916, and they would endure up until at least 1926. But usually when we're speaking of the Civil War, we're talking about what starts to happen in 1918, 1919. The scale of that can be seen by the fact that over 10 million lives were lost from battle, disease, famine, etc. And I think this is a very good summing up, because the Bolsheviks presented very similar to what the Montagnards did in the French Revolution. They presented the war, the Civil War, as being all these reactionaries supported by Allied powers wanting to overthrow the workers' state. That was the Bolshevik state. In point of fact, Smiley, not sure how I pronounce his name, but very good book, sums it up thus: Russians fought Russians, Russians fought non-Russians, non-Russians fought non-Russians, Republicans fought monarchists, Socialists fought Socialists, Christians fought Muslims, towns fought the countryside, families fought family, and brother fought brother. That really nicely puts it. That is, although when we look at the regional distinctions, that is the regional terrains of the conflict, we can start to make sense of who's in opposition with each other. We start to see, though, that, well, as you shift from area to area, and even within groups, there's all sorts of other conflicts going on. So the big myth that the Soviets perpetuated was the whites were basically fighting to restore the old order. And in the main, that simply was not true. But I'll come back to that, but that was just, that's an oversimplification. And the other myth, they said that they were encircled by all these allied enemies at the end of the war. And again, in both instances, there's a little grain of truth. If I had a big silo and I'd say you find a couple of grains in there of wheat, the rest of it was all sand. It's analogous to the amount of truth that there was in the Soviets' claim, because ultimately the numbers, as we will see, with the Allied forces was absolutely negligible, and the Western world had so little interest in carrying on any fight with what was going on in the Russian Empire. And in fact, you might recall me saying, United Kingdom, United States were only too happy to have got rid of the Tsarist autocracy. And there were various different reasons for that. Some of them were straight out business reasons, and especially in the case of the United States. But the idea that this was basically the Bolsheviks had all the support of all the people, and everybody else was either a reactionary wanting to restore a hugely unpopular Tsarist government, or a Western imperialist trying to restore. This is just ridiculous. It's so stupid it barely bears countenance. Okay, now leaving aside the Central Asian states, it's the Cossacks play an early part in declaring independence, and we'll see a whole lot of regions declare independence. The majority of the Cossacks were very anti-Bolsheviks, though about 20% did fight on the side of the Reds, so it's not complete. The policy, which became known as de-Cossacization, was ultimately depicted the Cossacks in class terms. And remember, class is the currency of the Bolshevik imagination. It's the currency. So anyone who is ultimately seen as an enemy of the strategy and the tactics of the Bolsheviks is ultimately going to be recognized as a class traitor, even though class has really got very little to next to nothing to do with it. But because the Bolsheviks see themselves as the embodiment of the interest of the proletarian class. This is why they do this, even though, as we said, many of them are intelligentsia and don't have anything to do with the working class, but boss them around. Now, there's some, what is also very interesting when you read about this is that the Cossacks themselves, that's basically an ethnic group, and they're represented. Now, this doesn't last, but for some time at least, they're representatives of a zoological world. That's a formulation from some document from the coming out of the Central Committee, coming out of Bolshevik leadership. And Trotsky had said in 1980, we must extirpate, let's get rid of all Cossacks, then peace and calm will come to southern Russia. So there's mass executions, deportations, an influx of non-Cossacks into the territory. So an attempt to wrestle back by changing the ethnic demographics of the region, wrestle back the region. So a directive of, in January the 24th, I can't remember if this is 1918 or 1919. Anyway, urges to conduct mass terror against wealthy Cossacks, extirpating them totally, to conduct merciless mass terror against all those. You see this is a strategy of terror, and food requisition or confiscation, confiscate grain and compel storage of all surpluses. Ultimately, this would be diluted and abandoned, because this is absolutely savage. But by then, when it is abandoned, it's because the scale of the civil war has got so big that they can't turn every Cossack against them. So that idea vanishes, and you just now become more selective in which Cossacks are going to be your enemy. Now, I said the Civil War is ethnic minorities and nationalism are going to be very important. And indeed, throughout the whole history of the Soviet Union, the matter of nationalism and ethnic minorities is going to have a very big part to play. Going to have a huge part to play. And when the Soviet Union ultimately collapses, it's because, in spite of every possible attempt by the Bolsheviks to create a sense of Soviet unity, of commitment to the common program, it never really succeeded in extinguishing ethnic and nationalist sentiment. And so straight at the end of the Soviet Union, in the last 2 years before Russia itself pulls out, the Russian Federation pulls out of the Union, that's the end of it, in 1991. So when it's all coming apart, but by 1989, everything is coming apart. You've got all these nationalist emancipatory movements. One writer, an economist called Ludwig von Mises, who was a very anti-communist economist and a very interesting economist, insofar as he predicted right at the origin of the Russian Revolution, right at the start, around the start of the communist world, he predicted two things, both of which proved to be true. He said the Soviets will never solve the economic problem that you're saddled with when you have a planned economy. That there will always be bottlenecks, and although it'll be able to create certain kind of heavy industry program, ultimately consumer satisfaction is never going to be high. And that was one major component in the breakup of the Soviet Union, and it was the one thing that China rectified by allowing markets in China from the 1970s onward, which is why they didn't follow the Soviets in completely dissolving themselves. In China, they retained this Leninist political form, but got rid of at least to a sizable extent, the burden of a planned economy. Not completely, but to a large extent. The other thing, says Mises, is that they can't solve the nationality problem. And they didn't solve the nationality problem. What happened is that early in the piece, we see attempts by the so-called whites to galvanize and strengthen certain nationalist sentiments and ethnic sentiments in certain regions. They're ultimately defeated. Or we see successful nationalist liberation movements, which the Soviets will eventually decide, look, we leave well enough alone. We'll let them go. But we'll make sure we keep an eye on them. And in a way, to think of the fate of Poland, how it's basically becomes a satellite state after the end of the Second World War. And after millions of Poles have also been killed by the Soviets in Warsaw, for example. And so the Poles copped it from the Nazis and the Soviets. And all the generals that were killed during that time when early on in the Nazi-Soviet pact, where they basically carved up Poland between them. This was, that's why to this day Poles generally hate communism. You find very few Poles that have a good word to say about communism. Okay, so this map, look at it, you can see where the cities controlled by the Bolsheviks are, where the attacks against the Bolsheviks are. And the thing I want you to note here, this map tells a very important story, is basically the urban centers' communication systems are all in Bolshevik control. Why is urban centers? Because that's where you're making the ammunition, where you're making the arms. So this is, although you might say, oh, that could have been encircled, the fact is that the supply side of the conflict is favoring this group that is the Bolsheviks in the center. So the Finns declare independence in 1917. Finland was always able to stay outside of the reach of the Soviet Union. It was always more half a foot in that camp, but it was always independent from then on. It wasn't conquered again after the Second World War. It was a combination of Democrats, Social Democrats, and Conservatives, bourgeoisie, and it defeated the Reds. They were victorious against the Reds. Nationalist, liberal, Republican regimes, backed up by allies, but it's not a huge amount of backup, as we'll see. It was set up in the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. As I said, after the Second World War, that would be another story. And the Ukrainians, initially, they just wanted a kind of semi-autonomy, happy to work with the Bolsheviks, but then they became more nationalistic minded, and ultimately, though, they would be defeated. And we'll see that the heavy price paid by the Ukrainians for their defiance of Russia. And there was also a Polish-Ukrainian war, and the Poles, backed up by the French, were victorious. Now, in the Ukraine, there was a massive outbreak of anti-Semitism, and I won't go into all the religious, cultural, traditional reasons why there was such hostility towards the Jews there. And what always happens in these areas is the poor bastards that have so little get caught up in this. So the hostility that's being directed mainly at more wealthy middle-class Jews, who are only a relatively small percentage of the population, that gets all swept up in this hatred and anger and persecution of anyone who is a Jew. So again, you would recall me talking about the Bolsheviks and the Jews. The Jews that were Bolsheviks, they were really not religious Jews. They weren't religious Jews at all. They were happy to get rid of their Judaism, but ethnically they were Jews. And most Jews weren't Bolsheviks, but there were a number of very prominent Bolsheviks, and in some regions, the Bolshevik Party had a disproportionate number of Jews. Now, I've also said this idea that there should be proportional representation of groups within any social practice is a highly questionable one, and we see this being used in all sorts of ways today. And I'm always reminded of the damage that is done by that way of thinking. It does far. It's exactly the kind of argument that the Nazis made. The Nazis used to put out graphs in which they would say, look how many Jews are at university. How smart they are. That's not fair. Look how many Jews there are in this kind of industry. That's not fair. But why? Why? Why should there be a parity between the choices people make, their decision to want to go to university or to work hard, and the outcome? Why should there be, and the ultimate say, there's no, but this is how the fascists think, and unfortunately today many people who don't realise they're reproducing fascist things also think. This kind of statistical breakdown is sheer hell in my opinion. Anyway, and it was hell in the Ukraine because the pogroms there were just terrible. So generally, in the Civil War, the whites there were anti-Semitic. And don't get me wrong, the Bolsheviks could also be anti-Semitic. They weren't great. And when Stalin got into power, there were waves of anti-Semitism. But in the main, and it was especially towards devout Jews by Jewish Bolsheviks, but in the main, the hostility towards the Jews, that you recall the hostility to the Jews that had been part and parcel of Russia generally. I spoke about this, the pogroms that occurred there. Well, this was also the case in the Ukraine. So General Denikin had red territory, but it already had half a dozen other armies in operation, including the anarchist rebels led by Nestor Makhno, who formerly fought with the Reds, but we will see later that he turns against the Reds. As part of this, it's all against all. Then you've got General Wrangel operating outside Crimea. Remember, Crimea, it's given to this day, Crimea and the Ukraines are in the news because Crimea became part of the Ukraines when Khrushchev was leader, becomes leader in 1955-56. And this previously Russian territory is given to the Ukraines, but of course the Ukraines were still under the domicile of the Soviet Union. So when Ukraine gets its independence, Crimea goes along with it. But when there's a coup in the Ukraines in 2014, and there's all these attacks upon Russians, ethnic Russians who are the majority in Crimea, there's a plebiscite and Crimea then goes back to Russia. It's a very complicated story, and the more pro-Ukrainian people will want to give you a counter-narrative to that, but in the main, that is how I think ethnic Russians definitely see the picture. But by the end of 1921, the Ukrainian National Army was defeated by the Bolsheviks, and it ends up being a founding member of USSR. But its experience under the Soviet Union is one of the worst regions in terms of the horror that will be before. Now, you can look at this map at your leisure, but I do hope that you look at it. And this is also, Smiley has a play to part in that. You remember me quoting him earlier. He's the one that does this great book on the Russian Civil War and brings out the territory. So you can see all these different attempts to create new kinds of states emerging in the Civil War based upon ethnic regional lines. And of course, they end up being overthrown or end up not happening. You might also look at this map, which I think is a very good map of where the different areas going on and what's happening with the Civil War. Just a snapshot. some of this I'll talk about more. In fact, I will talk about it more, but look at that at your leisure, bearing in mind the rest of that, what we're doing in the lecture. Now, I will say a general, obviously in a topic this big and we're moving so quickly, I want you to get an idea of the main important aspects of the Russian Revolution, of what led to it, why it occurred, what the forces in conflict are before, during, and after, and the trajectory it takes. That's the whole point of giving this lecture. So I can't go into depth about military history or the Civil War, but I do, as I said earlier, I want to divest you of certain commonplace myths, because the myth tends to replace the complexity of the reality. In the main, the whites, led by nationalist army officers, they were frequently not ideologically coherent. Denikin is a good example of that. So, and again, if you've got a nationalist army, you can see that you're split between different class interests and different wants, and you have to adapt to that. In the main, though, it's not true that most wanted to restore the monarchy. There were some, but in the main, there was a recognition that that way had gone. They tended to be suspicious of social, so there was often tactical alliances, but they were difficult to maintain trust in, and often they didn't last. In the main, they were poor at politicising and mobilising population in its territories. It too, they tended to use terror as well, but I tell you what, when it came to the kinds of terror that they would mobilise, the Reds had it on them, because they would kill your family members as well as you yourself. Now, there was, as I said, neither side had clean hands. This is a war, but ultimately the political endgame was not something that enthused the population of its territory. So remember, the Bolsheviks have got two things going for them. They've got many things, but major things going for them. One is ideological enthusiasm, and I mentioned the terrain they're occupying. Two, well, there's a few things. Two, and Trotsky, you've got a ruthless and quite brilliant military strategic leader, even without any experience of it previously. He'd been his whole life a revolutionary, but not a military man. Most unusual. And three, that outside, on the other side, those people who are forced to fight for the whites, they're the great mass that don't give us stuff. So they're not enthusiastic about fighting for anybody, but that means in the terrain which is occupied by the whites, they're not willing to fight for them either. So that's just a disaster for you if you are really reliant upon them and they're not enthusiastic. They tend also, I said they're often nationalists, but the nations and the demographic spread of what's going on in these territories, there's lots of ethnic minorities. And that would be quite complicated, how to match up the ethnic minority interest with a broader national interest, and that's not easy to do. You've also got, remember, the Bolsheviks have basically the industrial centres. The more skilled people, the more, insofar as you can speak, they've got the intelligentsia. Whereas outside of these areas, you've got a much more backward population. And they're not, as I said, they're not, because of this ethnic composition and everything, they're not a people that are so, nation building is a very middle class in the main. It's a very middle class. We saw this in France. You know, the nation, nationalism, It was really driven by those urban professionals. And then the army was very useful for helping activate that. And so peasants going into the army, then identifying ideologically, but it's being spearheaded. It's being spearheaded by, not by the peasant class, but by the classes. And this is also the problem for the whites. This is a problem. It has a population that's not really enthusiastic about nation building. It's not enthusiastic enough. When some Bolsheviks do terrible things to them, yes, they'll pick up arms, but in the main, they're not really ideologically driven. And often they're caught up in their own civil wars, and people are just fighting. It's pandemonium, it's chaos. I mentioned the problem of link-up. And here again, you can see different phases, moments, times on the map on the left. Ultimately, the whites are defeated. Kornilov had the famous Ice March. That ends in failure in the Cuban campaign. Denikin, conservative nationalist opposed to foreign dependency, leads the volunteer army but defeated in the winter of 1919-20. Admiral Kolchak, not a czarist, but he's a military coup in Siberia, but then he's defeated, sets himself up as supreme leader of commander-in-chief of all Russian land and sea forces, but none of them are able to link up. This is the point, they can't link up. And in part, they can't link up. So the supplies, where you actually do have supplies that someone's deficient in them, and in any military campaign, you need that supply route open. That's been cut off that's cut off because of the territory that the Reds have. So again, good fortune to where the revolution breaks out. They couldn't find a common cause. And they certainly, and here's the thing, in trying to do the nation building, they need the middle class to work with them and the wealthier classes to work with them because they're relying upon them for resources. But the peasantry don't want to give up the land that they've got, just as the peasantry won't want to give up the land to the Bolsheviks. But then the Bolsheviks won't care, under Stalin at least, they'll just go and take it, ruthlessly so. Some were supported by the British, very small number of troops, not for such a long time, but it wasn't enough. And a number of the generals, they didn't want to ally with ethnic minorities seeking independence. One lot allies with and then betrayed by the Czech Legion. I'll talk about them in a moment, and hand over to the Bolsheviks. So let's talk about foreign power involvement. From February to May 1918, you recall that German, Austrian, and Turkish troops had occupied 17 Russian provinces. Now, the Allied intervention was tiny. There were Germans, there were sizable amounts of Germans there. But then, at the end of the war, then they start to retreat. I think they'll get what they want, but they don't want to be bogged down in all this civil war and all this crap. The Bolsheviks, now there's good reason for the Allies to be there. The Bolsheviks have rejected foreign debts. They've nationalised British and French factories, combined with the decision to leave the war, so they're no longer really part of the Allied cause. Remember, it's not until November 1918 that the armistice exists in the West with the Germans. So they have supported, usually through financial or arms or various things, supported. But if you look at the troops, let's leave out the Czechs, and that's a special case. Let's leave them out. And we see these numbers are relative. The biggest one are the Japanese, 70, that's a lot. They're part of a land grab. That's part of their, remember Japan had already fought and won a war against Russia that also played a role in leading up to the first revolution. The aftermath of this revolution, or the midst of this revolution, they're seeing other opportunities, and Japan is trying to make themselves a new imperial power. So they've got a land grab going. But the other numbers, a minuscule. United States has interest in Vladivostok, and again they send 11,000. Estonia 11, but ultimately these are very small in the context of of armies that just want to go home, that are just sick of it. And there's a few hundred, 150 Australians, even a few hundred from the United Kingdom. I think it's 250, something like that. Now, the Czech Legion is a really interesting story. Some 50,000 troops. They had fought with Russia against its own empire, Austria-Hungary. And they were being evacuated into the Eastern Front when skirmishes then broke out between the Hungarians and the Bolsheviks. So they get caught up in this skirmish, and they're really basically trying to make their way home. So they're basically going to come into conflict and ally with who's ever going to help them get the hell out of the place. That's you can read about that. It's a very interesting story. I don't want to go too far into it because I only have half an hour or so. There were two major famines in the Ukraine. So if you understand it, once you get that, then you'll see why so many Ukrainians supported the Nazis in the Second World War, why the Ukrainians welcomed the Nazis. They hated the Russians. And as I said, this still plays through to this day, and the tensions between Ukrainian and ethnic Russians ultimately would lead to the coup that took place in 2014. But basically in 1921, 1923, there were some reports of this coming out into the world. In the main, there were lots of newspapers, lots of intellectuals that were so supportive of the Soviet Union. They either denied that this was true or just kept silent about it, but it was terrible. It was basically mass starvation, maybe up to 2 million. Many of the victims were children. There were accounts of cannibalism. And there had been also in a Russian famine. But the Bolsheviks used all their resources to try and offer relief for that, but they didn't care about the Ukrainians. There was foreign organizations ultimately, and especially the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, put pressure to organize distribution centers in the Ukraine for food parcels sent by American Jews to their friends and relatives living there. But again, you can see if that food is only going to, I've got family members I'm an American Jew. I've got family members in the Ukraine. Here's food for them. And then other people are starving, those Jews again. See, this is the unintended consequence of all this horror. But the famine really was a death blow for the Ukrainian nationalist liberation movement. So the Russian famine was also huge. But again, the starving members were people of different national minorities. So here was the thing, that the Bolshevik Revolution, Marx himself never adequately theorized. He did comment on some nationalist revolutions, he did, but he always looked at any nationalist revolution into how it fitted into the larger world revolution of communism as he envisaged it. He always saw it that way. And the problem was that nationalism would be one of the most important shapers of the relationship from empire and empire and within empires. It would play such a decisive role in the First World War. It would play a decisive role in the nationalist intensification that is part and parcel of National Socialism and fascism. And Marx largely ignores it. Lenin leaves it to Stalin. Stalin is smart, but Stalin basically sees that all these national minorities have to be kept underfoot. They have to link up in some way with the Russian majority, even though Stalin comes from Georgia. He's not a Russian. That doesn't matter. He's very smart. He's very strategic in seeing what kind of tactics you need to deploy in order to keep the revolution afloat, which is ultimately his driving. Okay. Now, there was some conservative, there was some monarchists, as I said, but it's not typically definitive. But there was also leftist revolts. And the best of, and the most well-known or important of this was the Tambov Rebellion, which was led by the former left socialist revolutionary and one-time Bolshevik ally, Alexander Antonov. And, you know, what's driving it? Reaction to grain requisition. Absolutely understandable. The peasantry are going to react to the fact that they're working all day and then someone's going to come and take away what they've created and all the work they've done and not pay them sufficiently for doing so. There had also been a Kronstadt revolt in 1921. Now, what is important about this is in the 1905 revolution, the 1907 revolution, the Kronstadt sailors had been the vanguard of revolutionary consciousness. And now they're speaking up against the Bolsheviks, and the Bolsheviks, led by Trotsky, go and shoot them. Some estimates say there's 15,000 were killed. No one knows the exact figure. But in terms of the symbolism of the revolt, symbolism in terms of who they are revolting and what they wanted, they basically want exactly the kind of things that the Bolsheviks had always demanded, or all the socialists had always demanded. They wanted freeing of socialist and working class peasants, prisoners, you know, soldiers, sailors, political prisoners, freedom of speech, right of assembly. All of these things were exactly the kind of things that when the Bolsheviks were in opposition, that they too were requiring. But once they get into power, these go. It's identical to what you see with the Montagnards in revolutionary France, where you've got this great constitution. You'll remember that. This great constitution comes out, and then almost everything that's really radical, revolutionary, brotherhood of man style stuff is actually being negated by the actuality of the Committee of Public Safety. Okay. Come back briefly to the Red Army. I've touched on this, but they controlled the city. Here you get the figures. Half of the party members were in the army. That still meant there were a lot of people that were in the army that weren't in the party. So something like 5 to 2, 10% of Red Army party men. But conscription was driving the show. And early on, there are a lot of people deserting, getting sick, and casualties. But by 1920, there were 5.3 million. There were systematic roundups, and this was the thing, is you weren't going into the army to fight for the Reds because you wanted to. You were going into the army to fight for the Reds because you happened to be in an area under their control, and you had to. Lenin had moved the capital to Moscow from Petrograd, a better positioned city in terms of centralized coordination. As I said, that network then, as Moscow was a sort of central network of communications, of rivers and railways, this made it easy to feed the supply lines. Now, Trotsky introduced a strategy which wasn't by any means accepted by all Bolsheviks, but Lenin went along with it. Stalin hated this idea and actively worked against it. On at least one occasion, Stalin made sure, orchestrated that a number of generals were executed, really because they were ex-Tsarist military people. and on the basis of treason, but it was all trumped up. And Trotsky was furious at him for doing this. But Trotsky was tactical enough or resourceful enough to know, look, we've got to win this war. We don't have enough people with military experience that are good at this. We're going to have to employ those that were our ideological enemies. And he eventually, that's 48,000 ex-Tsarist officers. Now, not all the Tsarist officers were necessarily their ideological enemy, but in the main. But the threat was defeat could mean death, not only for you, but for your family. So you had a massive incentive for this cruelty, this brutality, this strength of will. Remember me talking about the strength of will of Lenin. The strength of will now that's moving through the Bolsheviks in the same way that it had done again in the French Revolution. But they quickly turned upon each other. It didn't last that long. Here now, this is really going to be galvanized. A system is being set up that has much longer duration than the French Revolution. So there's this fear. This is from Trotsky, right? Who gets assassinated in Mexico by someone working for Stalin in 1940. I'll talk about what happens to Trotsky, other bits of what happens to him a little later. The enemy needs to be rendered harmless, and in time of war, that means that the enemy needs to be destroyed, to which end the most potent weapon is terrorism. No doubt, this is obvious what's happening. This is Zinoviev, who will also be executed by Stalin. To overcome our enemies, we must have our own socialist militarism. We must carry along with us 90 million out of the 100 million of Soviet's Russian population. As for the rest, we have nothing to say to them. They must be annihilated. So whenever you start to feel sorry for the people that are being killed under Joseph Stalin, you have to bear in mind that these are the people that were absolutely willing to ruthlessly kill other people. Now, the reason I raise this is, again, there's a lot of mythology around Stalin. And I do want to demystify that mythology. And I simply want to say that Stalin happens to be the person with the greatest ability in pushing through the Leninist program, given the people that he has to work with and given the conditions under which he has to work. There is, and as with these characters, there's an ironness of will. But it's not just the ironness of will that Stalin has, which Lenin had, which we see here in Trotsky and Zinoviev. It's plus another, to use a cliche term widely used today, another skill set that enable him to be able to achieve his aims. Now, what I'll be emphasizing is the line of continuity between the objectives of the revolution, as we see in Lenin, and we already have pointed out ages back that there's some major breaks between Lenin and Marx, but Marx himself had already indicated his own willingness to compromise his theory when he was dealing with the Russian socialists. And the fact was that events overtook theory. And Lenin, and then we will see Stalin, are much more, if that's your program, this is what you're going to have to do. If that's your program, what you're going to have to do. And as I kept saying, the program inevitably required lots of blood to make it work, because the program was something dreamt up, not that was developed over time through social experience, but was really the brainchild of the social dreams of a particular group who whose experience of wanting to change the world was the defining feature of their lives. And you recall back to the kind of things we saw that were being said by those terrorist cells in Russia. They're exactly the same kind of things that Lenin is pushing for, and they become actualized under Joseph Stalin. Now, the roots of this I had already touched upon when I spoke around the establishment of the secret police, the Cheka. And I strongly recommend that you watch, I think I put this in the course guide, there's a horrifying and brutal movie, and it's really, so if you can't take horrifying and brutal, you won't want to watch it. But if you want to get a sense, it was made in 1990, or 91, a Russian movie. It's called The Checkers. The Checkers. I strongly recommend you watch it. It's harrowing, and it gives you an idea of the scale of persecution that was conducted during the period of time called the Red Terror. There were people who had visited the Soviet Union, or at this stage still the new revolutionary, visited revolutionary Russia, reporting back on it. Some of them were socialists. In the main, the Western press ignored them. It was a perfect example of what the press do all too frequently. They either, because journalists are people, just people like anyone else, but they tend to want reality to be a certain way, to see it a certain way. They tend to favour stories that suit their picture, and they tend to be silent about what doesn't suit their picture. But there were books coming out that were pointing to the scale of the Red Terror, and if you go to archive.org, you will find some of these. One of them is even called The Red Terror. It was written in the early 1920s, but there's a number of books about this period that were pretty well contemporary accounts of the horror show that was going on in Russia. And it was a horror show. So it became official policy from September, so basically 1 year after the October Revolution, of killing certain lots of people. And it's a very long list. It included Civil War captives. The bourgeoisie becomes a catch-all. Who's a bourgeois? Anyone that doesn't fit what you want. Former officials of the Tsarist regime. Anyone deemed unsympathetic to the Bolsheviks. And of course, just as in the French Revolution, as people denounce each other, anyone can find themselves on a list. And they're just being shot en masse. Socialist revolutionaries, anarchists, unwilling conscripts, deserters, advocates of retreat, saboteurs, so even in industry. So does army, you think you've got army, you've got food supply, you've got ammunition supply, that is industrial supply, not just ammunition, but all the bits and pieces that are necessary to win the war and develop the country to some extent. Anyone in any of those positions, it's fair game if they're disobedient to the Bolsheviks. There's also looting, there's raping and torture. The idea, that these were the good guys and they treated, their prisoners with some kind of respect. It was carnage, and raping and looting was part of it. And again, if you read contemporary accounts of this, it's just damn horrifying. Now, I said to you earlier that one of the problems with the Tsar, much like Louis XVI, is that they just did not have the will to deal with the forces of opposition who were far more willing and would resort to scales of violence unimaginable to people like the Tsar or to Louis. Unimaginable to them. In spite of everything said about them being privileged and out of touch and soaking up blah, 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 their capacity for cruelty, personal cruelty, was relatively limited. We even remember in the first Russian Revolution, the Tsar didn't order the firing on the protesters, led by Father Gamble. Anyway, he didn't order that. And I very much doubt that he would have ordered it. Between 1825 and 1917, there had been 6,321 death sentences by Russian courts. Many of them were not carried out. There was that many, almost that many deaths that occurred under the Red Terror on this, to all these people on the left, by 1918. So really, you're comparing a period of 2 months with a period of, what is it? It's not 100 years anyway. It's 90 years, 97 years. Something else I wanted to say there. Okay. What then replaced the Cheka in 1922 then became the KGB. They claimed in the mid-1920s to have more than 2 million Soviet inhabitants under permanent watch. And there were also people opening their mail. And again, this was stuff that the the Tsarist government has done, but the scale is altogether a different order. It's just a completely different order of terrorism, surveillance, censorship, whole other scale, all justified under the name of the revolution. So if we look at, that's why I said earlier, if we look at the white terror, it pales into insignificance. Here's a statement from Lenin. Lenin says, "We need to clean the land of all Russia, of all vermin, of fleas, the rogues, the bugs, the witch, and so forth. 1 in every 10 idlers will be shot on the spot." So here is the language of utter dehumanization. We will find the Nazis do exactly the same. But this, in a sense, is what is happening with mass politics. And we see a similar kind of language deployed in the French Revolution. Now, don't get me wrong, I've said from day one in this course, this is not a course about morals. I'm not interested in doing that, because at the end of the day, we are dealing with all these forces that played themselves out. But if someone wants to morally justify this, then they're a complete idiot. There is no moral justification for it. I'm sorry, there's no moral justification. And I would happily argue that there was no moral justification for what the Tsar did. In all cases, what we're really looking at is about tactical survival to deal with circumstances. That's really what the Russian Tsarist autocracy was saddled with, plus the kind of programs, in the case of the Tsarist autocratic authority, of modernization, and in the case of the Soviets, with their program of achieving communism. The problem with the communist goal was, what I've pointed out all along, was ultimately it is going to set, it's wanting to establish something that there's no reason to believe that it can be established. That is the problem. If it could be established, great, but there's no reason to believe that there's any possible, or to put it another way, when Stalin in around 1940, I mentioned this, on YouTube says, "We've actually achieved socialism, gentlemen." And he's basically said, you know what they all wanted in the 19th century, but we got it. They're all clapping enthusiastically, cheering him on, because they know if they stop clapping, they could end up in the gulag. I know I said this before, but repetition won't hurt. Watch that on YouTube. It's extraordinary. You see, that's what happens, is the shit heap then becomes the days of gold and glory. But you can't deliver real days of gold and glory, so you call the shit that you've got the great stuff, when it's, yeah, you could say it what? It was an improvement upon what? Improvement upon what? What would have happened had the Bolsheviks not seized power? You know, we can ask these counterfactual questions. What would have happened? Well, everything would have had to be different for that to be the case. But had that happened, I think you could safely say that the industrial level of development of Russia would have been far superior. But the point was that didn't happen. And in part, I actually think it couldn't have happened because of all these other forces that played themselves out. It is true that the will of Lenin, had Kerensky had something like that will, then maybe, but he didn't. He just didn't have it. And Lenin and Stalin and Trotsky and Zinoviev and Kamenev, they're really a bunch of butchers, but they're a bunch of butchers with a program. And Lenin is part of that, as I said. And this, you can read that bit of figures. It's just basically saying what I'm saying. That it begins under Lenin. It doesn't begin under Stalin. And when we get to the fact that Lenin had criticisms of Stalin, which he did, but basically Stalin was very rude to Lenin's wife, and Lenin couldn't forgive him after Lenin had a stroke, particularly. He couldn't forgive him. But that's personal. Ideologically, Stalin hoisted his mast to Lenin's sail, or Lenin's sail, hoisted his sail to Lenin's mast. That Stalin ultimately is very much wanting to push through the program that Lenin wanted to push through, and this will come out. I'm going to go for about 10 minutes overtime today, because I'm more or less on track, and the lecture I want to give on the social revolution in the 60s is the kind of thing I can discuss in half an hour or 2 days, but the essence of it is in a sense easier to grasp because we live within it. But I do want to press on a little bit more with this, so next week's lecture there will be some continuation of what's happening, especially under Stalin. So I mentioned the phrase war communism before. That was basically it was a period of civil war, and it was also a period in which no one really knew what was going on, except there was raw brute power. Private trade, hiring of labour, leasing of land, all private enterprise and ownership, all abolished. All industry under the command of the Bolsheviks. Confiscation of grain and livestock to feed army cities' droughts. Food requisitioning, bound to piss off the peasants, which it did. This is also what contributed to those famines that I spoke about in the Ukraine and the Russian famine. There was an administrative rationalization. At times there was just no pricing system at all. The currency was worthless. Inflation was rampant. You know, they were doing things like similar to what had happened in the French Revolution, stealing all the stuff from churches. It was like the more radical wing of the French Revolution, but in a sense, the whole revolution, the French Revolution, was very, as I said, really anti-Christian, but then it divides itself into those that see de-Christianization has gone too far, but you know, they wanted to, as had happened in other places before the revolution, and to some extent it even happened in Russia, as I mentioned, taking over church property, but now they were taking any church valuables. They were being sold off. That was going into government coffers. Labour was being conscripted and organising militarily. They were imposing production quotas. So what was beginning to happen very quickly is you were taking basically a military model and imposing that on industry, whereas generally the industrial model varies from a military model in a whole set of ways. There's often some overlap. There can be some overlap, top down, you do, blah, blah, that kind of behaviour. But the more entrepreneurial, open aspects of capitalism, that's ignored here because there's no capitalism, there's no market. Everything is quota, and if you don't live up to the quota, you're going to be in trouble. And this, over time, this would become a terrible thing. It was also the beginning, and again, this is Lenin, under Lenin, the slave labor camps for work on large-scale construction, mining, and industrial projects. What's called a gulags are set up. The United States had a civil war in the mid-1860s about slavery. To a modern mind, it is absolutely unconscionable, shocking, that slavery persisted so long as it did in the southern states of the United States. And it was always a kind of weeping wound. There was always this tension and conflict between the northern and southern states on the basis of what kind of economic model it should have and also the different vested economic interests. No one but no one in 1870 or 1880 would have seriously thought that in the 20th century you would have two states in which slave labor played an important industrial role. And those two states were Nazi Germany and Soviet Union. And yet they didn't. In the case of the Soviets, though, whereas with the Nazis, their justification of that on ideological grounds was that the Jews were an alien people, though it wasn't only the Jews in the Roma, the homosexuals, and some other groups were going into these camps, and then they would become death camps as well. But the Soviet Union relied absolutely on all sorts of canal digging, certain mineral extraction, deforestation, you know, in wood. It relied upon these slave labor camps. So what had begun as this great project of emancipation had already in 1919 created a slave labor component of the economy. As all this is happening, output, economic output goes into freefall. Now, again, if you go back to Karl Marx, the whole point of communism in Marxist theory is, on the one hand, it's meant to get rid of alienation. That's what he says very early on in the 1840s, when he's very young, 26 or so, in the 1844 manuscripts. But the other key argument is that it solves the economic problems, particularly the economic crises and impoverishment on a large scale that occurs because of capitalism. And what's taken place in the post-communist period is agricultural. Now, of course, it's caught up in a civil war, but nevertheless, what we're seeing is not only that there's a civil war, it's got no idea. And again, you think about it, none of these people have run anything. They've been professional revolutionaries all the time. They've read a few books. They've read literature. Why would you think? I mean, look, I'm a 65-year-old professor. I wouldn't want to start a fish and chip shop. And I wouldn't think if I did, I'd do very well at it. I'm not well equipped for it. Now, okay, you've got a bit more energy when you're young. If I was 20 or so, I might want to start them, or 25. But my point is, these guys go from reading books, talking, organizing assassinations, bank robberies, as in the case of Stalin, who was involved in a number of bank holdups, get money for the Bolsheviks. Why would you think that would remotely equip you to help modernize an economy? It's insane. But the hubris is there. And it's come out of the whole intellectual culture which is the real tragedy, is because these are just, you know, the kids, they're going into university, they're all imitating each other. They all think they know everything. Everyone is, in a sense, is putting moral pressure on it, which is how people act in groups, putting moral pressure on each other to act in such a way that, you know, they each like each other. They don't deviate too far from that. Then they gain political power, and now they've got to try and get these other classes, of which they've had precious little experience except talking to and act. They're going to try and build a country, and it's disaster. You can see the figure. It's absolute disaster. So, Nikolai Bukharin, who gets executed by 1938, there's a whole literature about what a nice guy Bukharin is, but I don't, none of these. I think it's a damned generation. I think it's a sad generation. I look at that photo and I see a young man haunted in a sense. And then I read about his future, how he's begging Stalin to save his life, and Stalin won't save you, and how close he'd been because he had been involved in conspiracies against Trotsky with Stalin, and now he's being turned against. But, you know, when they were in the position, die someone else, they didn't hesitate. So that's why I say I think they're a damn generation. They're caught up in this great wheel of circumstance, which in part they've made themselves, but there's so many making it. And their faith in themselves, their faith in their own intellectual power. I keep emphasizing how little we know, but the arrogance of the professional classes, the damage it's doing today, to this day, is extraordinary. And you will live to experience that, I'm afraid. So I'm seeing it, but I see it grow. But that's another thing. So coming back to these guys. As we deal with an organized national economy, he says in 1920, all the basic problems of political economy, such as price, value, profit, etc., simply disappear. Look, that's moronic. That's so stupid. But that's what Marx had said. That's what Lenin believed. They all believe this. That's what Stalin thinks. They all believe this. It's complete nonsense. They're in chaos. So being in chaos, they've got to react. So what do? They do the only thing they can do at that stage. Well, no, not quite. They come up with what's called the new economic policy. So they realize that just taking stuff from the peasants, it's creating too much of a backlash. Remember, this begins around the Civil War, so it's just too hard. It's not because I think there's two things going on here, or two things that it's not. It's not because they've softened, and it's not because they've become more brainy about it. At the end of the day, the program remains the program, which is to say, the faith in the impossible, because that's what those economic objectives are. You don't need a price, you don't need profit, well, good luck. You don't need a market, well, good luck. Good luck. You can get some things without that, and you'll get exactly the kind of things that the Soviet Union had, and you'll basically only be able to get them through the methods of the Soviet Union. And then you see, well, no one wanted it. At the end, it was terrible. It didn't work. This is not, and I repeat time and time again in various lectures, it's not because the market is capable of proceeding without the state. It's because state and markets both are intrinsic to certain modes of human action, certain ways of participation in reality, which are ultimately separate from each other, but they end up having to work in relationship with each other. If they want, if what you want is not just control and direction to get people, and in a sense, a slave-like economy or a command-like economy, but you want to give people what they actually want, then you have to be able to direct resources to that. And the only way to know what they want and to efficiently direct the resources is through a market. But that market will never operate completely divorced from the state, because you're going to have all sorts of laws to deal with the intrinsic problems of market cooperation. There are intrinsic problems to it. This is the thing, you see. The revolutionary don't think in terms of living continuously with problems. They think in terms of an ideational world in which the problems won't exist. And what we see is, in trying to implement it, they compound the problems. It's far worse. So what had been happening, so what the new economic policy does is it says, look, they can keep some of their produce. This is exactly what happens in China in the 1970s. It's exactly the same thing. And the Chinese government then, instead of what happens in the Soviet Union, allowing it and then crushing it, the Chinese government allow it to take off and then expand it, realizing that you have to have some kind of capitalism to have the growth that you want. Okay, we'll come back. So, although there was still collectivization, there was a degree of retention that would be profitable. And then, so productivity and wages started to work together. And a class of intermediaries arose to coordinate the buy-in. So you basically had a market zone, and central planning was pulled off, so the markets were coming back into. Between 1922 and 23, private trade accounted for 90%. Looting was still official policy. That hadn't, and it was in 22 that the stealing church treasures became, it was been happening earlier, but that became official policy. And it was starting to work. Things were starting to work. Now, when this occurred, you see, this is beginning under Lenin. But then Lenin has a stroke and he's basically out of action till he dies in 1924. Lenin had said, maybe we can let this run as long as 10 years. But given the program that all these guys wanted, and it's interesting here, I've given you there, all the people died, survived, suicide, shot, murdered, shot. That's what happens to them. Given the program, this could only ever be a momentary solution. Now, from the get-go, it was ideologically divided. Trotsky didn't like this at all. And this is ironic because Trotsky's criticism of Stalinism would be that it was too statist and bureaucratic. But he doesn't want any markets. Well, obviously he thinks that there can be workers will get together and decide how much is produced, but I mentioned before, this creates an endless conundrum of economic problems. The time spent talking about it, how do you know what resources there are? You need planning, you need central committees. You cannot do this without a bureaucracy. Trotsky is a complete fantasist. Sorry, given Lenin or Trotsky, give me Stalin, sorry, given Stalin or Trotsky, give me Stalin any day, at least in terms of having a grip on reality. It might be that he comes up with a horrible reality, but the only reason Trotsky didn't come up with a horrible reality, or any more horrible than what he was doing in the Russian Civil War, is because he didn't have the power. Not because his ideas were better, but of course those that follow him are dealing with a whole set of untested ideas whereas Stalin puts his money where his mouth is. Bukharin is considered a rightist and broadly favours his solution. And this would come back to haunt Bukharin. This would be his demise. And Stalin recognises exactly the game, but much cleverer tactician in every which way. I think if Stalin had been a man for a good cause, he would have achieved a lot. Even though, having said that, I'm not sure if the qualities that Stalin possessed could ever be put to service in any really good cause. But that is, the circumstances need a guy exactly like Stalin. Okay, so he's originally, but then he sides with one and then turns against the other. Okay, I'm going to call it a day there. I think I can get through everything I need to by the end of next semester. And enjoy your week.